Tuesday, June 16th, 2015, and the theme for tonight's gathering is the body's role in enlightenment, and this is Reverend Laura Smith. And so why don't we start with the invocation, just to get the energy set. So let's take a moment now to get settled, to center ourselves, to let go of the events of this day, and to begin to enter the deeper, sacred space within ourselves. Now let us imagine that we're joining together, sacred heart to sacred heart, with every other person on this call right now. Now let us imagine that we're joining together in a circle with a light or flame or fire in the center. Imagine a spoke of light coming from the center of the circle to your heart and for each person on the call tonight or listening in afterwards. Now we are connected, sacred heart to sacred heart. Now let us set our intentions. We listen to one another with compassion and curiosity. We ask for what we need and offer what we can. We deepen our connection with one another and the divine. May this sharing serve us, our communities, and the planet. And so it is. Thank you. Okay, so we can begin. So I have quite a lot of information here, maybe more I can get through. It's a nice small group on the call here, so I think we'll have plenty of time to digest this and so on. So what I think might work well, I'll present some ideas, and then we'll have a few exercises interspersed, and then we'll have some time for discussion at the end. So this topic kind of came to me. I've been reading a lot about body work and the body in the context of healing, and I happened to read Eckhart Tolle's The Power of Now, and my mind started popping with all of these connections and kind of parallels, and what really stood out to me this time was that Tolle's whole theology is very much based on the body, and he really gives the body and the felt sense a lot of importance in his kind of path to enlightenment. And so I started kind of being curious about what would actually mean in kind of specific terms. What kind of particular structures and functions in the body and so on, could that apply to, and what implications might that have for our healing? Okay, so I'm really excited that on the call tonight we have physicians and body workers and so on. So I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on this. Okay, so this topic is, I think, really relevant to us in Tzaddi as a church, because we do focus on healing as a main form of our spiritual ministry, and also on direct spiritual experience and kind of meditative and mystical states. And as we know, the body is really central to both of those. So in the healing area, of course, the interface between subtle energy and consciousness in the body is at the root of what we do, but again, what are the particular mechanisms and, intersection points of those levels and so on. And then, of course, the meditative disciplines of mindfulness and so on, yoga, qigong, and so on, these great, world traditions focus very much on the body, posture, breathing, work with often subtle anatomy like the chakras and meridians and so on. And so again, how, what's the mechanisms there? How does that interface with physical processes? Okay, so starting out, I'll give kind of a little overview of Tolle's theology, and then look at a few specific physical functions and structures that might add dimensions to what he's suggesting there. And so I think, kind of looking at it on a whole, what we can kind of see in these, as a parallel in these bodies of thought is this idea that there's a kind of a feedback loop or a causal chain between the body and the mind, the kind of conceptualization. And Tolle talks a lot about kind of negative conceptualization and negative emotions and so on. And so the chain would be more or less that constricted body posture and function, things like muscle tension or a kind of hunched over shoulders and so on, leads to certain emotions like fear or anxiety, and then these would lead to certain mental loops, certain styles of thinking, and so on. And so, of course, this is not a new idea. It's really at the basis of kind of Eastern medicine, yoga, and so on. But again, I think there's some really interesting kind of specific connections we can make between the kind of disciplines of body work and somatic consciousness and Tolle. Okay, so if we look at Eckhart Tolle's theology, it's imagine most of you have come across this in one way or another. It's become really popular. But again, what stood out to me was really his focus on the body. And so, I could call it a kind of a theology of embodiment. And, as we know from the title of his book, The Power of Now, he focuses on this kind of experience of the present as a doorway into a kind of a metaphysical, realm, a realm of being, which goes beyond kind of mental thought, and this being is really a state of enlightenment. He actually calls it that a couple of points. It's a non-dual state. But what's really interesting, I think, and very kind of distinctive is that he really links this with a somatically experienced present moment. And so he focuses a lot on what is called in kind of the bodywork worlds the felt sense. And so some fancy technical words for that might be, proprioception, the kind of ability to perceive where the body is in space. Interoception is this sense of kind of the internal organs and the sensory input that comes from those. And so, again, for Tolle, it's this body awareness, this felt sense that is really the way to kind of cut through the mental loops and this kind of superficial ego-based reality and drop into the present. Okay, so if we kind of stand back and, analyze that, for a minute as a theology, we can say that there are a couple of really interesting things about it, that when you compare it to kind of classic mindfulness practices that might talk more about kind of a lucid awareness or the witness state, Tolle really is focusing more explicitly on the felt sense of the body. So I think that's very interesting, and it kind of opens up this whole range of parallels between some of these somatic modalities like craniosacral work and Qigong, Rolfing or structural integration, focusing work, Feldenkrais. My own background includes Rubenfeld synergy method, which is a kind of a combination of body work and Gestalt, and so it's very much in that zone. Okay, and so secondly, then there's a kind of a physical feedback loop that's a corollary to the mental feedback loop that Tolle speaks of as the pain body. So this idea that fear generates constriction and holding, and this gives rise to pain and fear-based thoughts. Okay, so that's kind of suggested in Tolle, but he doesn't really nail it down to anatomical specifics. But as I was reading a lot of the bodywork material, some of those very specific links are really suggested. And so one interesting one is from a great book called The Endless Web, which is really a book on kind of Rolfing or structural integration, work with the fascia or the soft tissue. And the authors there say that physical response to emotion is through the soft tissue. The fascia is the emotional body. Okay, and so that I think is a really interesting idea to explore in process work. And so they give a couple of examples. We inhibit our body postures and so on when we don't want to feel things. We kind of numb ourselves out through our posture sometimes. One example would be someone in emotional pain who kind of transforms it into physical pain, into a tension headache, this kind of thing. And so the point that these authors make from the Rolfing perspective is that these are learned behaviors. They're not kind of innate. And so, we can work on them and undo them through therapy. And so there's one other thing that's interesting about Tolle's theology, and that's his very distinctive interpretation of the Christian gospel. And, if you remember his work, he actually talks a lot about the Christian scriptures, but in a very interesting, a very particular interpretation that, meshes very nicely with our orientation in Tzaddi. But, again, it's very much on the kind of the body and being present in the world. So we could term that a kind of a theology of immanence as opposed to the kind of transcendent focus of mainstream Christianity. In any case, that's the case that Tolle makes. And so he kind of suggests that that's a distortion and really encourages us to come back to our bodies. Okay, and so one of the interesting parallels that popped out, I don't have time to go into it deeply here, but I'll just kind of call out the reference, is by an author named Jed Sumner. His book is called Body Intelligence, and his website is the same name. And he, coming from kind of a bodywork perspective, but his background is in Qigong and so on, he has also evolved a kind of mindfulness meditation that focuses on the felt sense rather than the kind of lucid awareness that he feels might become too mental, perhaps, in our kind of Western culture where we're too far to that side of the pendulum anyway. And he suggests that the focus on the body, the felt sense, is really a way beyond the egoic mind. And he roots this in a lot of, kind of physiological background and so on. So I think that's a very interesting kind of convergence there between Tolle and someone from the kind of bodywork meditation world. Then there's another thinker, Frank Forensich, who's also a kind of a movement expert. He works a lot with this kind of evolutionary biology point of view that, we evolved in the distant past in the savannah, and so on, and we're really designed to relate to each other kind of face-to-face and navigate the outdoor world. Okay, and so here, in this topic, there are all kinds of kind of fascinating branches in different directions, and, we could go off on them and so on. And so I'll try to restrain myself from doing that, but I'll just kind of touch on a couple of, these branches. And so he starts to talk about the kind of social impact that kind of modern life is having on us and our bodies. And of course, one of the main things that we're grappling with right now is the influence of digital culture, cell phones. Everyone's on their device. We all have computer neck, computer shoulders, and so on. And so he makes a really interesting point about the impact of digital culture and kind of modern life that I haven't heard anybody else make so specifically. And he says, he kind of brings in Dan Siegel, the psychologist's idea of emotional intelligence. And Siegel has a concept of the resonance circuit, which is really this kind of neural mechanism that allows us to empathize and communicate with each other. This is kind of the physiological basis of body language, so to speak, or nonverbal communication. Okay, and there's a lot of talk now in these circles about kind of mirror neurons and so on, and this whole mechanism. And it turns out, and I'll talk more about this in a minute, that one of the main mechanisms involved in this resonance circuit is the vagus nerve, which goes, innervates the gut and kind of controls a lot of our physiological processes and allows us to feel our sense of interoception, or what's happening on our inside. So it's very much involved in the felt sense of empathy. Okay, so the point that Forencich makes that I think is really interesting is that it kind of brings up the point, okay, this is a neural circuit really on one level, this ability to kind of empathize with each other on a human level, something that's, a very spiritual, function in many ways. And he brings up this concept of kind of atrophy, this kind of use it or lose it principle. And he makes the point that this holds true in other neural situations. If you have a muscle, if you don't use it, if you have a cognitive capability, if you don't use it, it atrophies, it goes away. Okay, so why wouldn't this be true about this resonance circuit? And so, the fact that we're less and less relying or exercising this ability to empathize with each other may actually be kind of eroding these physiological, systems that we have. Okay, so I think that's a very interesting kind of connection with Tolle and his talk about how the kind of egoic level of consciousness in the mind kind of takes us away from authentic communication and the body and so on. Okay, so I know that's a lot of information. I'll keep going and talk a little bit about some of the particular physiological mechanisms that we can connect in here, and then we'll pause to do a couple of exercises along the way, and then we can unpack all these ideas. Okay, so there are 3 or 4 particular, physical structures and functions and so on. We've touched on a few of them already. So the first one, I'll just kind of lay them out and then go into them. The stress response and the relaxation response is one. The vagus nerve would be involved in that. The second one would be posture. This would be the role of kind of the soft tissue informing, how we hold ourselves, how we move through the world. The third one would be the role of breathing. And so there are some different pieces to put into place along the way. Okay, so the stress response and the relaxation response is one of the physical mechanisms that we can point at in this pattern of kind of constriction versus being really open and relaxed and in a kind of a meditative state of mind. Okay, so the link that we're, interested in making here then is, so what are the physical states, that would really be conducive to this, transcendent experience of the now. And so this is a phenomenon that's talked about a lot in psychology these days, so you're maybe familiar with it. But just in brief, the fight-flight response is, the kind of innate reaction to fear. It's associated with the sympathetic nervous system, and it creates these physiological reactions of kind of cutting off the sensation to the gut, so the vagus nerve, would be taken offline. It stops digestion. It kind of sends the blood to the extremities so you can run from the saber-toothed tiger and so on. And so basically, physiologically, we could say that it's pretty close to a kind of a dissociated state, a state that's really not very introspective, not very empathetic. Okay, so conversely, the relaxation response is one where the kind of internal sensation of the vagus nerve and other mechanisms kind of comes into play. Our breathing becomes deeper and so on. And so what's interesting is I was reading, I came across a couple of very specific links to these ideas in the material of cognitive psychology and kind of biofeedback. And so some cognitive psychologists such as Sophie Reed and Aaron Beck and so on have actually made the specific link between the fight-flight state and negative thought or negative cognition. Okay, and so they say the specific components of cognitions in the fight-flight response seem to be largely negative. These negative cognitions may be characterized by attention to negative stimuli, perception of ambiguous situations as negative, the recurrence of recalling negative words, and so these kind of negative thought loops. Okay, so I find that very interesting. That's a very specific link, the kind of smoking gun, between what Tolle is laying out as a kind of a theological idea and then this kind of hard, science. Another link might be the very, influential book, The Relaxation Response by Herbert Benson, which is, very classic by now, and he was looking at transcendental meditation and its ability to activate the parasympathetic nervous system, lower blood pressure, and so on. And so again, there's a kind of a positive example that, positive thoughts, saying a mantra, and so on, has a physiological response. Okay, so that's a very interesting link. Okay, and so we've talked about the vagus nerve in all of this, and so I won't go into it more. There's a lot of interesting kind of detail there, and I'll just say that it's very interesting to note that a lot of the kind of classic psychosomatic stress disorders that we see, even racing pulse or irritable bowel syndrome, fainting, these are all physically connected with the vagus nerve, loss of speech, when someone is hysterical and so on. These are all associated with the nervous system in this way. And so again, that kind of gives us a key into maybe how we could work with Tolle's principles on a physical level. Okay, so then we come to posture, and we'll have our first exercise in a second here. And so there's a lot of work by kind of Rolfers and people who are interested in fascia and so on about how we hold tension and constriction, these patterns of constriction in our bodies as learned patterns. And basically, as we know, at the most basic level, the baby, of course, is in fetal position in what we call anatomical flexion, with the the legs and arms curled in. And so then as the infant develops, she learns to stand and so on. And so this more extended posture of being open, opening one's chest and arms, having the head back and so on, would be a kind of a posture of openness to new sensation, new experience moving through the world. And so as body workers know, when people are stressed, which is pretty much all of us in this modern world, we have these classic patterns of holding. One of the classic ones is what's called, kyphosis or upper crossed syndrome, where the shoulders are hunched, the neck is kind of craned forward, and, some people call this kind of cell phone neck or computer neck, and I think we're lucky if we don't have it in these days. Another important part of that is the psoas muscle, which is in the kind of pelvis and runs from the lower lumbar spine through the pelvis into the trochanter of the femur. And so that is the kind of primal stress muscle of kind of curling up in fear, basically. And so I have a quote in here somewhere about Ida Rolf talking about how the psoas muscle is the kind of primal muscle in the body that gets flexed when people are under stress. Okay, and so then these core patterns kind of echo out into other physical patterns that we carry, through our lives. And as we've seen, then we start to cognize or have mental thoughts that match that physical pattern. And we can often cut off our sensation because we don't want to, or we're afraid to experience a memory of a negative emotion. Okay, and so what's wonderful about the bodywork approach is that we can maybe, instead of dealing with the story on a psychological level, we can go right into the body and address it on a physical level, and then again come closer to what Tolle is talking about as the now. So let's take a moment and just try this out, kind of very, very basic kind of core idea here. So invite you to just experience this posture of flexion and then extension, and kind of notice how that feels. So just, as you're sitting, become aware of, how you are holding yourself, and then just, exaggerate that kind of flexion, curling in. What does that feel like? What do you notice happening to your breathing? What kind of mood does that create in your body? And then when you've had a moment to experience that, then just begin to open up into extension and feel what that's like, arching the chest back, thorax, opening the shoulders up, putting the neck back, and just notice what feeling that gives and what kind of mood, what kind of way of moving through the world that might invite. Okay, and then, so in a minute we'll have a chance to share, but just kind of take that away. And so then the last physical structure here to mention is, last but not least, breathing. And of course, this is very, very fundamental to a lot of meditative disciplines, pranayama and qigong and so on. And one interesting fact that is kind of a physiological principle that grounds some of these ancient practices is the fact that when inhalations are longer than exhalations, the sympathetic fight-flight response is evoked. And typically, when we're stressed, we may have hunched shoulders, our breathing is shallow, the breath doesn't go down to the belly, and this becomes a kind of a negative feedback loop because we're getting less oxygen and so on, and then we start having more and more negative thoughts, we get anxious and so on, and the cycle, continues, okay? But what's fascinating is that when the exhalation is longer than the inhalation, the parasympathetic nervous system, the relaxation response, is evoked. And so it's very interesting to see how a lot of traditions have kind of used these principles. So I invite you as our second exercise to just play with this, and I'll just kind of count some numbers so we have a reference point. So if we kind of do 4-count inhale and 8-count exhale, and we'll just take a few breaths in that rhythm to see what we notice. So inhaling on 1, 2, 3, 4, and exhaling 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And inhaling 1, 2, 3, 4. And exhaling 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, and so you may want to experiment with that later, but that maybe gives us a taste. Okay, and so then the third little exercise, and then we'll open up the floor, and I'm very curious to hear your thoughts about all of this, is just to kind of palpate our diaphragms, because I think this is a muscle that, in yoga classes, typically they deal with it more than most places, but it's a very huge muscle and very essential to us, but a lot of the time I think we don't even know it's there, and a lot of us are holding a lot of tension there. And so just to review, the diaphragm really is a big wall of muscle that kind of separates the abdominal cavity from the chest cavity, and it really creates a dome all around the rib cage, kind of starting from the top where the sternum, and then going down to the sides, so along the sides, and then anchoring to the pelvis and lower spine. And so you can kind of reach in with your fingers if you kind of go to the edge of your rib cage and just put your fingers in there. For me, it's very sore. I notice right away that it's very tight. And just, see what is there. And I'm noticing for myself, I have a lot of tension here that I'm not even aware of most of the time. And what would happen? How would I walk through the world if I could do some body work on that and open it up a little bit more? And might bring me a little bit closer to what Eckhart Tolle is suggesting in the present moment. Okay, so I could go on, but I'll leave it here, and I'm very interested to hear your thoughts about all of this. So whoever wants to chime in, please do. And if you're muted, you may have to unmute.
Hi, Laura. It's Amy.
Hi.
I love what you've put together. It's just so delicious and so interesting. Thank you for all the care and thought that you've put into this and the great energy. I think this is such valuable and important information for everyone to think about, and I love that we're focusing on it as a group. The thing that was most salient, there's so many things that I could say, but the thing that was most salient for me was when you led the breathing exercise. And I don't know if it was just my imagination or if Diane was also feeling this, but it reminded me of when I did distance swimming, because you turn your head to take a breath, and then you do a lot of strokes. If you're doing freestyle swimming, you do a lot of strokes exhaling that breath. You don't want to breathe on every stroke or every other stroke because it takes energy to lift your head, and it slows you down, and it also tires you out. So typically the swim coach would tell us when I was a competitive swimmer, that you wanted to get a good breath and then go as long as you could on that breath. And when you started counting, before you started counting, I was, playing with breathing at different intervals, and I had done Kundalini Yoga in college, and of course this is a big part of Kundalini Yoga is different ways of controlling your breath. But when you started counting, I was right back in the pool. I was right back in a distance swimming space, and I realized that I wasn't meditating when I was young and I was in distance swimming, but that was taking me into samadhi-like states. And that part of it is just the amount of flow that it gets going in your body when you're using all your muscles and you're relieved of the pressure of gravity and you are just moving, intensively. That can really throw off a lot of tension and make you very alert and relaxed and oxygenated. But it's also the breathing pattern. And I was just, it was so great to have you lead us in that particular breathing pattern. That was just a joyful, joyful moment for me. Thank you.
Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it. Yeah, and it's interesting that seems to be an example where your system is quite active, rather than being still in a kind of a meditation, and yet it still took you into that kind of relaxed, so to speak, state. So that's interesting. Great. So,
hi, Laura. It's Nancy. Oh, sorry.
Hi.
Nancy. Laura, thank you. That was so interesting and wonderful. It really was terrific. I enjoyed it so much. So just in terms of the exercises, the first thing I noticed when I flexed my body was instantaneous. My breathing stopped. And that was very surprising to me because it was so dramatic. And so that was the first thing I noticed. The second thing was when we were doing the breathing, I did really experience a calming in increasing the exhalation. So I love that. I think it's a wonderful tool actually to use. And then, can I talk about some of the things you mentioned before that?
Oh, please. Yeah.
So there were two things. One thing I thought of, which I just want to mention because it was so illustrative of this, which is that when I was working in this hospital, even after, I remember talking to the head physical therapist because I was having issues with my neck, and he was trying to tell me about the positions that I held myself in and how it affected that. And he said that he had that the most common thing he saw in the hospital, particularly, for all of the employees, but particularly for the different chairmen and women of departments, was, of course, neck and shoulder pain and kyphosis. And he said that they never believed him when he told them that stress and stressful situations lent itself to them getting in these very bad positions, because these in meetings where they weren't working on computers, but they were sitting around the meeting table. they didn't believe him and they thought he was crazy. So what he did was he filmed them when they were at meetings where they were talking about personnel and finances. And then he filmed them when they were having lunch and just shooting the breeze and talking about their vacations and stuff like that. And it was very, very clear that when they were talking about finance and personnel, they were hunched over, their necks were forward of their shoulders. And when they were eating and just hanging out, they were relaxed and sitting in positions where, you know, the shoulders were erect and their neck was on top of their shoulders and their head was on top of their neck. So I always thought that was a great example of this stuff. So I wanted to share
absolutely.
that.
Proof.
Excuse me. And then the other thing I just wanted to mention, and this is really a question on what your thoughts are about this, is when you were describing it, I can't remember which book it was or which person who, or whether you had put together both on one hand the relaxation response and on the other hand the stress response. But my experience in actually experiencing, well, obviously I experienced both like other people, but, you know, I really get the meditation response, having done that for a long time. But in studying the stress response and the fight and flight response, you know, under many different circumstances for many years, my experience of that, my understanding physiologically of it is that, you know, stuff happens on Earth, and whether it was, you know, years ago when or in some other cultures where you're walking in the forest and encounter a lion and you have to run, or whether it's a modern situation where, you know, you're involved in cars honking or, you know, people screaming, that the flight or fight response works really in your favor. In other words, all of the functions of it work to bring you to homeostasis so that, you know, your natural response diverts blood from your digestive system to your muscles when you need it to run, and your adrenal glands shoot out adrenaline so that you can run, so that you can save people if they need saving or save yourself. And, you know, your blood clots so you don't bleed to death when you're getting out of it. And so it was always my understanding that it was a miraculous way that our body actually helped us to stay in homeostasis and to manage, except when you are exposed to repeated stress. And that's when the whole system breaks down and has very negative consequences for your body and your emotions and your mind. So I just wanted to see what you thought of
I think that's a really good point to you know, underscore that, you know, maybe we should be very thankful for our bodies, you know, for protecting, you know, rather than kind of demonizing, you know, the sympathetic nervous system. You know, it helps us to survive and we need it, you know, and so, you know, I think that's a really, you know, really important point. But I think you're kind of calling on, I guess, Peter Levine would be, this seems to be pretty standard these days, is Waking the Tiger, his work on trauma.
Right.
You know, and as you're saying, you know, I think it's the chronic stress that a lot of these thinkers say is, you know, really a product of kind of modern humanity, you know, and maybe was not present, you know, the system wasn't designed to be on all the time. And for various reasons, now it's on all the time, and we don't seem to be able to deal with it very well.
Right, exactly.
So, yeah, you know, that's a good point, that the organism's trying to keep balance any way that it can, but maybe it's stressed in certain ways.
And I think, you know, to your point, is that there's just too much stress in modern society. You know, the digital world and all these other things. And I think so many people are suffering from this chronic stress syndrome. which
Yeah,
overwrought.
it certainly seems that, way to me, living in New York City, and I was fascinated by, this Frank, his idea. I'd never made that connection before, but, again, his point is that, we were really evolutionarily designed to be spending time outdoors and to be interacting face to face, and that's what we did for, thousands of years. Hundreds of thousands of years maybe, and now those two things are really diminishing more and more, and so we're under a lot of stress in that way.
That's a good point.
Yeah, so there's another. I'll save this. I won't add any more to the pot unless people have run out of things to say. Diane, you want to share anything?
Yeah, thank you very much, Laura. It's interesting. And just to follow on the overstress comment, I found it interesting, or many things, but one was the use of in the digital age, and that just as muscles atrophy from non-use, the same might be happening to empathy. So it's curious, maybe an overuse, as in stress, is, and then the systems don't work for how they're designed. And maybe the same is true, on the other end where it's not being used. It's kind of interesting.
Mm.
So that the system is designed to keep things in balance, but when there's too much or not enough, then it doesn't support either way, because it wasn't designed to be overtaxed, and it wasn't designed to not be used. So maybe something along that line.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point.
Yeah. I was interested, too, in the fascia tissue that, if I understood correctly, that the emotional body is throughout the fascia, which is everywhere. Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah, I was really fascinated to be reading some of this stuff from the kind of Rolfing world, and they actually put it that way explicitly. Again, this quote, the physical response to emotion is through the soft tissue. The fascia is the emotional body. It's the physical proprioception that we inhibit when emotion or energy is inconvenient, so on and so forth. So, that's a very direct connection that people who are into this kind of thing make. So that has, a lot of implications. And maybe and somewhere else it says, another quote I have here, that rather than where Ida Rolf kind of took her own perspective was, rather than kind of analyzing different characterological types, kind of based on body type, and calling it schizoid or what, and kind of labeling it from a psychological perspective and working with it then on that basis, you can actually kind of work directly with the physical pattern of holding, and then, open that, work with that, and then the thoughts and the character will change, as the body structure changes. So I think that's a really appealing idea for me.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. Well, I was thinking then of plantar fasciitis, and I was thinking about, that whole thing of the foot and the Achilles heel and where that pain point, and, that's what I always think of immediately is plantar fasciitis when I think of fascia tissue, which I know is everywhere. But I never connected an emotional piece to that, and I would be curious what that's about. I talked to somebody who has studied Chinese medicine and thought, and also does a lot of physical things, and I thought, maybe I could get some points about how at that time I had my right calf was hurting a bit, and I knew it was fascia. And I thought, oh, maybe I could get a good stretch or two, learn. And he said, oh, that's liver and kidney stuff, and I was like, really?
Mm.
So, then that gets into a whole other thing. And then, of course, the Chinese have certain emotions that are connected to kidneys and are connected to the liver. And I thought, oh, well, if it's all in the fascia, and maybe different parts are connected to, just like reflexology, that your ear has some liver points and acupuncture and acupressure and all that stuff. I just, it all starts to get connected. So my mind went on a whole spin around this fascia tissue and emotions and, what it all means and how we hold it.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff, and it's just that kind of comparison between the Eastern, the Chinese system, and then the kind of Rolfing viewpoint.
Yeah.
Is, really interesting to explore.
Well, thank you very much.
So and I'm happy to pass along the resources, the references, that I used, and I'll just call it. There's one podcast that several of these thinkers, how I got exposed to them, which is really fantastic. It's called the Liberated Body podcast, liberatedbody.com, and it's just like a cornucopia of all this sort of, body-mind stuff. So I highly recommend it if you're interested in this.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Okay, so any other comments, reflections?
Well, this is Nancy. I would just say, I said one other thing to say at the end, which is that it's funny, when I was listening to Diane, I was at a Chi workshop the other day, and they were discussing just then about these certain positions which will most closely resemble Qigong, if I had to say what it was, but that this one particular position called Sung Kwa had to do with really activating the fascia and connective tissue and how you felt when you were in that position. So I just heard that really for the first time in that aspect this weekend. But the other thing I just want to mention is that I'm wondering, Laura, if they, in this huge array of references, did people talk about Candace Pert and the work that she did with emotions that, when we were talking about, I wonder how that works in the fascia, that if that has anything to do with the receptors that are apparently all over the body for emotions that she, delineated 40 years ago. And I wonder if there's just more receptors in fascia than in certain other, like, musculoskeletal areas.
Yeah, I think that's where the Rolfers are coming from, is that there's actually a physiological, kind of basis for the, where the nerve endings are, is kind of in the soft tissue and so on. And I'd have to track that down a little bit more, but I think that was the implication. But yeah, I didn't draw on Pert directly, but I've read her, Molecules of Emotion in the past, and I remember one quote that stood out to me at the time was, she says something like, the body is the subconscious. It's either subconscious or unconscious, as she says. So she also makes like a very explicit, statement there about, this body-mind link. So I think that's another piece, that would really, parallel, support this way of thinking.
And so when you talk about the body and its role in enlightenment, I think what I took from hearing it was that, you can't get away from your body, because that's the deal when you're here on Earth, and that all of these really interesting points you made and references are here to help us be, integrative individuals instead of like taking us out of the body or just focusing on it. That integration is the necessity to be able to become enlightened here on earth. You can't just quite ignore it. Living in the midst of all this. I mean,
that brings up a question for me, if I can jump in. Are you done, Nancy?
Yeah.
I'm curious, Laura, because you have a lot of years of study and great achievement and understanding of a lot of different theological perspectives. So I'm curious about, I'd like to bring you the question of, you mentioned early in the presentation, this is more of an immanence perspective instead of a transcendence perspective. And I can just speak from my own personal journey, is just I feel more and more compelled to that integrative space, to more movement, more outdoor activity, more body awareness. I've always needed to have a track of it, but I really need it now that I'm recovered from the long sickness that I endured, experienced. Mm-hmm. And so for me, the transcendent model is like really losing any kind of appeal, just me personally at this moment. And I don't want to say that it's wrong and immanence is right, but I'm just curious about, can you speak as an intellectual theologian, which you're really quite good at, about how to understand what we've spent an hour talking about and sharing about in relationship with a transcendence model, or is it just completely incompatible?
Yeah. Well, you're on to something there, because my little comparative religion wheels were spinning when I read that part of Tolle's, and he's very. I listened to the audio book first, and you hear him speak, and it's kind of so self-evident, when you listen to him, and but you could kind of say, if you look at that passage, to paraphrase it. He kind of says these approaches that have kind of tried to dissociate from the body are kind of misguided, and you really need to kind of just what you're saying, kind of be where you are, on the planet in a body, and then he says, and the Buddha